Rain hammered the roof hard enough to drown out the sound of approaching sirens. Deep in the woods outside a small farming town in the United States, police vehicles pushed through thick mud toward an isolated farmhouse sitting nearly a mile off the main road. The 911 call had come in only minutes earlier. A man's voice, shaking, breathless, told dispatchers he had found something buried behind his property. Something he was never supposed to see. He kept looking out the window while he spoke, as if he believed someone was already outside watching him. Dispatchers tried to calm him down. But before he could explain exactly what he had uncovered, the line suddenly went silent. Then came a sound investigators would later replay over and over again. A loud crash. Rapid footsteps. And the caller screaming one sentence before the call disconnected completely. By the time deputies arrived at 1:58 a.m., the witness was gone. His front door stood wide open in the rain. The lights inside the house were still on. His pickup truck sat outside with the engine running. Investigators moved carefully through the home with flashlights drawn. A chair had been knocked onto its side near the kitchen table. Mud covered part of the hallway floor. And near the back entrance, officers found a cell phone abandoned beside the doorway. But there was no blood. No sign of forced entry. And no trace of the man who had called police less than 15 minutes earlier. What terrified detectives most was not the disappearance itself. It was what they found recorded inside the emergency dispatch log. Because during the final seconds of that phone call, the witness had described details from a crime scene police had not discovered yet. A crime nobody else even knew existed. The town sat deep in the countryside, surrounded by thick forests and narrow back roads that stretched for miles without a single streetlight. Fewer than 4,000 people lived there. Most families had known each other for generations. Parents grew up beside the same people their children later went to school with. Neighbors stopped to talk in grocery store aisles. Pickup trucks lined the parking lot outside the local diner before sunrise every morning. The town moved slowly. Quietly. Church bells echoed across the valley every Sunday morning. Children rode bicycles down empty roads without anyone worrying where they had gone. Front porches stayed lit late into the evening while elderly residents watered gardens or waved to passing cars. Violent crime was so uncommon that many people never locked their doors. Some residents could not even remember the last serious police investigation the town had seen. To outsiders, the place felt untouched by time. Almost frozen in another decade. But beyond the farms and quiet neighborhoods stood miles of dense woods that surrounded the town from every direction. Old mining roads cut through the forest, many of them abandoned for decades. Rusting signs still warned drivers to stay away from unstable ground farther inside the hills. Most residents avoided those roads completely after dark. Older locals occasionally spoke about strange lights appearing deep between the trees late at night. Some claimed they heard engines moving through the woods long after the mining routes were officially closed. But stories like that were usually brushed aside. Small-town rumors passed around during late-night conversations at diners and gas stations. Nothing people truly feared. Years later, several residents would remember hearing dogs barking non-stop sometime after midnight on the night the witness disappeared. One woman living near the edge of town told investigators she thought she saw headlights moving slowly near the tree line shortly before 2 a.m. At the time, she assumed it was hunters or teenagers driving the back roads. Nobody called police. Nobody suspected anything unusual. Life in the town continued the same way it always had. Farmers opened their stores before sunrise. Retired couples drank coffee together outside the diner. School buses rolled through the same quiet intersections every morning. And just beyond those peaceful streets, investigators were beginning to uncover evidence connected to the terrified phone call made only hours earlier. A phone call that would soon place the entire town at the center of a growing criminal investigation. Nothing about that community suggested violence, until the witness made his call. The man who vanished that night was 47-year-old Theodore Williams. Most people in town simply called him Theo. He worked as a mechanic at a small repair garage just outside the highway entrance, a place where locals brought everything from broken farm trucks to rusted family sedans barely holding together. Theodore had lived in the town nearly his entire life. Quiet. Dependable. The kind of man people trusted without hesitation. After his divorce several years earlier, he moved into a modest farmhouse near the edge of the woods and mostly kept to himself. But even then, neighbors described him as someone who never refused to help people. If a car broke down during winter, Theodore showed up. If an elderly resident needed help repairing a fence or mowing a lawn, Theodore handled it without asking for money. Every morning before work, he sat in the same booth at the local diner drinking black coffee while reading the newspaper. The waitresses already knew his order before he walked through the door. Every evening around sunset, he called his daughter. No matter how tired he was. No matter how late he finished work at the garage. On weekends, he spent hours fishing alone at a nearby lake outside town. Friends said it was the only place where Theodore ever seemed fully relaxed. People remembered him as calm. Predictable. Easy to read. Which is why the changes in his behavior during the weeks before his disappearance frightened so many people afterward. Several co-workers noticed Theodore seemed exhausted lately. He struggled to focus during repairs. Sometimes he stopped in the middle of conversations and stared toward the garage windows as if he had heard something outside. One mechanic later told investigators Theodore had started checking the parking lot repeatedly throughout the day. He kept looking outside like he thought somebody was watching him. Friends also noticed he had stopped sleeping regularly. Dark circles formed under his eyes. He began arriving late to work, something almost nobody had seen him do before. Financial problems added more pressure. Business at the garage had slowed, and Theodore had quietly fallen behind on several bills after taking fewer repair jobs during the previous winter. Still, nobody believed he was unstable. Nobody thought he was losing touch with reality. One longtime friend later said something investigators would repeat often during the case. Theodore wasn't paranoid. That's what made this so strange. His daughter would later remember their final phone conversation with growing discomfort. He sounded nervous the last time we spoke. Like he wanted to tell me something but changed his mind. Then investigators uncovered another detail that shifted the entire direction of the case. In the weeks before disappearing, Theodore had started taking late-night drives through the woods surrounding town. He usually left after midnight. Always alone. Several residents reported seeing his truck parked near abandoned mining roads deep in the forest long after most people were asleep. When friends asked what he was doing out there, Theodore refused to answer directly. But one night, while sitting outside the repair garage after closing time, he quietly told a coworker something that would later haunt investigators. There's something out there people aren't supposed to find. He never explained what he meant. And at the time, nobody realized those words would become terrifyingly important. As October moved deeper into the valley, people around Theodore Williams began noticing small changes that slowly became impossible to ignore. The first sign seemed harmless. One morning, Theodore failed to appear at the diner for breakfast. That alone surprised people. For years, he had arrived at nearly the exact same time every morning, sitting in the same booth near the window with coffee already waiting for him. The waitress working that shift later told investigators she remembered checking the parking lot twice expecting his truck to pull in late. It never did. A few days later, neighbors living near Theodore's farmhouse reported hearing his dog barking aggressively long after midnight. Not normal barking. According to one resident, the animal sounded terrified. Another neighbor claimed they heard metallic noises echoing from somewhere inside the woods behind Theodore's property, Then came the sound of shoveling. Slow. Repetitive. Coming from somewhere beyond the tree line. The resident assumed somebody was illegally dumping trash or digging near the abandoned mining roads. By morning, the sounds had stopped completely. Around the same time, Theodore quietly began making changes to his house. He installed additional locks on both doors. He replaced outdoor floodlights that had suddenly stopped working. And according to receipts later found inside the kitchen, he purchased several heavy-duty flashlights and extra batteries from a hardware store less than a week before disappearing. Friends noticed he now carried a flashlight almost constantly, even during daytime. He also started keeping every curtain inside the farmhouse closed. One coworker remembered asking him jokingly if he thought somebody was spying on him. Theodore didn't laugh. Then residents began noticing a vehicle parked near his property late at night. Descriptions varied slightly, but most people recalled seeing an older dark-colored pickup sitting near the road leading toward the woods. Nobody recognized the driver. Several nights later, Theodore reportedly received multiple phone calls where nobody spoke on the other end. The calls usually came after midnight. He answered, listened, then hung up without saying much. The situation became more disturbing after someone smashed the porch light outside his farmhouse overnight. Glass covered the front steps the next morning. Theodore replaced the bulb immediately, but according to one neighbor, he seemed deeply unsettled afterward. Then came the moment investigators later viewed as a major turning point. One evening, Theodore told a friend that he woke suddenly during the night after hearing movement outside his bedroom window. When he looked through the curtain, he claimed someone was standing near the edge of the yard watching the house. By the time he grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the person was gone. After that incident, Theodore's fear became harder to hide. He stopped sleeping properly. Dark circles deepened under his eyes. Co-workers said he startled easily whenever unexpected sounds came from outside the garage. Then, during a conversation behind the repair shop late one afternoon, Theodore quietly told a close friend something investigators would later consider critical. "If anything happens to me, tell police to search near the old mining trail." The friend asked what he meant. Theodore refused to explain. What was hidden near the mining trail? Who kept appearing near his property at night? And why had Theodore Williams suddenly become so afraid? Investigators later discovered Theodore had even visited the county sheriff's office several days before his disappearance. Security footage showed him entering the lobby shortly after noon. For nearly 4 minutes, he stood near the front desk appearing visibly nervous. He kept looking back toward the entrance as though expecting someone to walk in behind him. Then, without speaking to anyone, Theodore abruptly turned around and left the building. No report was ever filed. But everything changed 3 nights later, when Theodore finally called 911. On the night Theodore Williams disappeared, heavy rain moved across the county just after midnight. Winds pushed through the trees hard enough to bend branches across the narrow back roads leading toward the old mining area outside town. Most residents stayed inside that night. But sometime after 1:30 a.m., Theodore left his farmhouse and drove toward the forest. Investigators later reconstructed part of his route using security cameras positioned near a gas station several miles from the abandoned mining trails. The footage showed Theodore's pickup heading deeper into the hills alone. No other vehicles appeared behind him. What happened next came almost entirely from the emergency call placed minutes later. According to investigators, Theodore had stopped somewhere near one of the abandoned mining roads when he noticed something unusual beside the tree line. Freshly disturbed earth. The ground appeared recently dug up despite the heavy rain washing mud across the road. Nearby, partially hidden beneath branches and darkness, sat what Theodore described as a damaged vehicle pushed off the trail. Then he saw movement deeper between the trees. Someone was standing there watching him. At 1:47 a.m., Theodore called 911. The dispatcher immediately noticed something wrong with his voice. He was breathing hard, whispering instead of speaking normally. And several times during the call, he stopped suddenly as if listening for sounds outside his truck. According to dispatch transcripts later reviewed by investigators, Theodore quietly told the operator, "There's a body out here." Seconds later, his voice dropped even lower. "I think they saw me." The dispatcher instructed Theodore to remain inside his vehicle while deputies were sent toward his location. But Theodore sounded increasingly frightened. "Please send someone now." Then investigators noticed another disturbing detail hidden inside the audio recording. In the background of the call, metallic banging noises could briefly be heard somewhere outside the truck. The dispatcher asked Theodore what the sound was. He never answered directly. For several seconds, the line went almost completely silent except for rain striking the windshield. Then Theodore suddenly whispered something investigators would later replay repeatedly during the case. "Oh God, they're here." The call disconnected immediately afterward. Deputies rushed first toward Theodore's farmhouse after losing contact with him. When officers arrived, the property appeared abandoned. The front door stood open despite the storm. His pickup truck sat outside with the engine still running. Inside the kitchen, investigators found fresh coffee spilled across part of the counter and floor, as though someone had knocked it over moments earlier. A flashlight lay abandoned near the driveway outside. But there were no signs of forced entry. No shattered windows. No blood anywhere inside the home. Still, investigators immediately believed Theodore had left suddenly. One deputy later described the scene as looking interrupted. As if something had caused Theodore to flee before he could even shut the door behind him. Then officers discovered something even stranger near the side of the property. Muddy footprints leading away from the house toward the woods. Investigators followed them carefully through the rain for several yards beyond the tree line. Then the footprints suddenly stopped. No return tracks. No drag marks. No indication of where Theodore, or anyone else, had gone next. But investigators would soon discover something even more disturbing hidden inside Theodore Williams' house. As investigators searched Theodore Williams' farmhouse through the early morning hours, they began uncovering items that immediately changed the direction of the case. Inside a desk drawer near the living room, detectives found several hand-drawn maps of the forest surrounding town. Old mining roads had been marked carefully in red ink. Certain locations were circled repeatedly. Some trails included handwritten notes beside them. Collapsed entrance. Fresh tire tracks. Dig site. Investigators also recovered pages filled with dates connected to disappearances stretching back nearly 10 years. Most of the names belonged to people from nearby counties. Several had vanished without explanation after being reported missing near hiking areas or rural roads surrounding the forest. Then detectives found a stack of old newspaper clippings hidden beneath Theodore's workbench. Every article focused on unsolved disappearances. Young travelers. Local residents. A woman who vanished while driving through the county years earlier. At first, investigators could not understand why Theodore had collected them. But the pattern became harder to ignore the deeper they looked. Several missing persons cases appeared connected to locations near the same abandoned mining trails Theodore had been visiting late at night. News of the discovery spread quickly through town. Residents who once believed Theodore had simply wandered into the woods now realized police were investigating something far larger. Detectives began interviewing longtime locals, former miners, and property owners connected to the abandoned mining area. Most denied knowing anything unusual. But according to case files later discussed publicly, one retired miner reportedly became visibly nervous after detectives mentioned a specific trail Theodore had marked on his maps. Investigators said the man abruptly ended the interview and refused further questioning. Days later, another resident connected loosely to the mining roads suddenly packed his belongings and left town without warning. That disappearance only intensified public suspicion. Then investigators decided to search the exact mining trail Theodore had mentioned before vanishing. The area sat deep inside the woods near a partially collapsed structure once used decades earlier during mining operations. Cadaver dogs were brought in shortly after sunrise. Within minutes, handlers noticed the dogs reacting aggressively near the remains of the collapsed site. Officers began digging through wet soil and broken debris while rain continued falling across the forest. Hours later, investigators uncovered human remains buried underground. The discovery stunned the entire county. But the biggest shock came after forensic identification was completed. The remains belonged to a woman who had disappeared years earlier while traveling through the region. Her case had remained unsolved for nearly a decade. Suddenly, Theodore Williams no longer appeared to be a frightened man imagining things in the woods. He had found something real. But investigators now faced far bigger questions. How had Theodore known where to search? Who buried the victim near the abandoned mine? And if Theodore had interrupted someone that night, was the killer still nearby when deputies arrived? As media coverage expanded, internet forums exploded with theories about the town and the mining trails hidden beyond the forest. Some people accused local authorities of ignoring disappearances connected to the area for years. Others believed the abandoned mine had secretly been used for illegal activity long before Theodore vanished. Rumors spread faster after several unexplained details became public. Security cameras positioned near roads leading into the forest reportedly malfunctioned during the same time Theodore disappeared. Audio experts reviewing the 911 recording also identified strange noises buried beneath the call, sounds investigators never fully explained publicly. One deputy involved in the forest search later claimed he briefly saw movement between the trees while officers searched near the collapsed mine. When other deputies turned their lights toward the area, nobody was there. But the most terrifying revelation came from Theodore Williams' final voicemail. 3 days after Theodore Williams disappeared, investigators recovered a voicemail he had sent shortly before the 911 call. The message had been left on the phone of a longtime friend who missed the call while asleep. According to investigators, the voicemail was recorded only minutes before Theodore vanished near the mining trail. Rain and heavy wind could be heard in the background while Theodore spoke quietly, struggling to stay calm. His breathing sounded uneven. And several times during the message, he paused as though checking his surroundings before continuing. Then Theodore said something that changed the entire investigation. "They know I talked." For several seconds, only rain could be heard striking metal somewhere nearby. Then his voice returned, lower than before. "If I disappear, don't stop digging." Another pause followed. And then came the line investigators would later describe as the most disturbing part of the recording. "There's more than one body." The voicemail ended moments later. As news of the message spread, investigators expanded their searches deeper into the forest surrounding the abandoned mining roads. Additional excavation sites were identified near collapsed shafts and isolated clearings hidden beneath thick trees. Over the following weeks, search teams uncovered more human remains buried in separate locations connected to the same area Theodore had mapped before his disappearance. The discoveries raised terrifying possibilities. Investigators began considering whether the forest had been used as a dumping ground for years without anyone realizing it. Several disappearances previously believed unrelated suddenly appeared connected by geography, timing, and forensic evidence recovered near the mining trails. Attention quickly shifted toward individuals deeply familiar with the woods and the abandoned mine system surrounding the town. Rumors spread about one respected local figure whose family history tied closely to the mining operations decades earlier. The individual had reportedly known the forest routes better than almost anyone in the county. Investigators never publicly named the person as a suspect. No charges were filed. But according to multiple reports discussed later in documentaries and local media coverage, detectives continued examining possible connections long after Theodore vanished. Even after major search operations ended, strange reports continued coming from residents living near the forest. Several people claimed they still saw vehicles driving slowly near abandoned trails late at night. Others reported unusual lights appearing near old mine entrances deep in the woods. One hunter told investigators he heard engines moving through restricted areas weeks after police searches officially stopped. Yet despite the massive investigation, Theodore Williams himself was never found. No body. No confirmed evidence proving he had been killed. No explanation for what happened after the final moments of the 911 call. It was as if he had disappeared into the forest completely. Then, several weeks later, the sheriff's office received an anonymous letter postmarked from another county. Inside the envelope was a single sentence typed across a blank sheet of paper. He should have stayed quiet. There was no fingerprint evidence. No return address. And no indication of who sent it. To this day, nobody knows who mailed the letter. The disappearance of Theodore Williams changed the town permanently. For weeks after the investigation began, reporters crowded the small streets that once felt untouched by the outside world. Satellite trucks parked beside family-owned stores. National headlines connected the quiet community to buried remains, abandoned mines, and a missing witness who vanished after calling 911. But once the cameras left, the fear stayed behind. Theodore's daughter continued searching for answers long after official searches slowed down. She spoke publicly several times, insisting her father had tried to help investigators before disappearing. Friends said she struggled most with the uncertainty. No funeral. No final goodbye. Only unanswered questions surrounding the last moments of Theodore's life. Residents who once treated the surrounding woods as part of everyday life began avoiding them completely after dark. The abandoned mining trails became especially feared. Hunters stopped using certain routes through the forest. Teenagers who once drove those roads at night stayed away. Businesses near the edge of town started closing earlier than usual. Some families eventually moved away altogether, uncomfortable raising children near an area now tied to years of disappearances and human remains. Even longtime locals admitted the atmosphere had changed. People locked doors that once stayed open overnight. Porch lights remained on until morning. And conversations about the mines became quieter whenever strangers were nearby. Months after Theodore vanished, residents gathered near the forest entrance for a candlelight vigil. Rain fell lightly as people stood beside photographs, flowers, and handwritten messages placed near the roadside. An empty chair was left at the front of the memorial for Theodore Williams. The chair remained untouched throughout the night. Eventually, investigators officially classified Theodore as a missing person. Leads slowed. Search efforts became less frequent. And over time, the case slowly drifted toward becoming another unresolved mystery connected to the woods outside town. But theories about what happened to Theodore never stopped. Some believe he died trying to expose a killer connected to the abandoned mining trails. Others think Theodore discovered something hidden beneath those forests that investigators never fully uncovered publicly. To this day, the old mine entrances have been sealed off and marked as dangerous by local authorities. But according to residents living near the woods, strange reports still continue. Some claim they occasionally see lights moving slowly between the trees after midnight. Others describe hearing distant engines deep in areas where roads no longer exist. And every few years, someone reports hearing faint knocking sounds coming from somewhere beneath the ground.